Greetings! Welcome to the Devlog for hot dogs, horseshoes, and hand grenades. We're going to be doing another deep dive video this week, talking about a single system in H3 in depth. This week it's going to be the agents, all of the various robots that are in the game. And basically what I wanted to go over this week is sort of doing almost a sort of post-mortem on the 5 different agents that are in the game thus far. That have gotten a lot of work put into them. Sort of what's worked, what hasn't, how they function and why they function the way they do, and what I'm trying to essentially collate and learn from the success and failure of each of those and put into practice in the next version of sort of bot AI that I'm currently working on. So to start off with, let's go ahead and do a quick overview of exactly like what a game agent is insofar as both in a game and as well as in H3 here. Starting with our simplest and oldest one. Here's Clunk Mark 1. We haven't seen him in a while. The way that most game agents typically work is that we have some sort of model representation of the agent. Obviously, typically, if this is, a human or a monster, it's what's called a skinned mesh. It's a single mesh with bones in it that animate in a particular way, with an animation state machine that is controlled by some sort of internal abstracted logic that is telling the agent where to run, what to fire at, etc. And so, in terms of H3's bots, where I started was something very simple, was to create a sort of like a tank-like bot, a single point of articulation, namely his turret being able to rotate and such, his gun being able to rotate up and down, and having these strike plates that can disable him. When I started making agents for H3, and this was more true of the sort of second generation of Clunk here, I had several goals that remain present in terms of what I think is what I'm trying to do in terms of making a compelling agent to fight. And those are, for one, I don't like what I would call cheater agents or cheater AI in games. i.e., what I mean by that is an agent that has perfect knowledge of the situation that it is involved in. Most game agents function to one degree or another in this way. They have a perfect access or notion of where the player is, what the environment is, etc. And then the agent is sort of artificially decimated from that perfect view to be beatable, basically, because an agent with perfect reaction time and perfect knowledge of where you are is going to almost always be able to beat out the player. And so for me, and this was something that was first expressed with Clunk Mark II here, I wanted to build a system that essentially interacted with the world as close as I could make it at the time, to being more like the player did, in that Clunk Mark II has sensor modules all over his body that are actually used to look for thermal signatures. The player's a thermal signature, certain weapon impacts are thermal signatures, etc. And then Clunk Mark II here has a memory where he remembers the last place that he saw things and tries to sort of sort those memories and threat levels of sort of sensor contacts that he's had, follow them, chase them, etc. And that component of him does actually work quite well. The reason that Clunk Mark II here still isn't very enjoyable to fight in the long run is that he's a tank, basically. And that ended up having, how to put this? I ended up building a tank because I wanted to build a mechanism that had a bunch of subsystems in it that could be independently damaged, to make it less like you were just fighting something that had like 100 health and fight something that had various sorts of nuanced subsystems that could be damaged that would then alter bot behavior. And you can see this to the right here in his hierarchy, that we have various sorts of sensors here. We have, there's his thermal signature. He has a separated sensor system, which is an independently damageable model. He has a navigation system that's an independently damageable model, etc. which is all good in theory, but this didn't work out in practice for a couple reasons that I guess probably should have been more obvious to me out of the get-go, which is that most of his sensitive... I essentially built him as though one would actually want to build a robot like this, which is to put sensitive critical modules inside him, i.e. behind his armor plating. And what this effectively meant is that any weapon system that you use against him that is an armor piercing is never going to damage these models. And so you can basically just whittle down the sort of base durability of his sort of core body work, which is borderline impossible with some round types, or just use an armor penetrating round that's going to cleave right through him and make him blow up. So it was, how to put it, I would sort of summarize the failure of Clunk Mark II as not being able to see the forest from the trees. Design-wise, building all these sorts of complex systems that aren't in any way transparent to the user. So the user isn't even aware that they're there as a way to fight against him, but more often that the type of equipment that one would have to bring to the combat situation with Clunk to take advantage of that can also just kill him dead in all sorts of, in a far more sloppy way, just sort of hammering him with armor-piercing rounds. So, but yeah, so that's how I feel about him. I transposed elements of that system onto the botwursts in Meat Grinder and essentially tried to partially fix the problem with Clunk, in that I made the sort of overall internal metal body, which is visible here beneath the the meat and cardboard. If we turn off these chunks momentarily, we can see the other end. So this is significantly less durable than Clunk Mark II under here, and you essentially have to chew away at the ablative armor on the Wienerbot here, on the Botwurst, I think these were called, to be able to damage him. But once again, this was a case of an agent and context mismatch, namely that in Meat Grinder, you were incredibly ammunition limited, which meant that a bot that has a whole bunch of ablative protection on it that has to be chewed through, even if you can now engage and destroy him without armor-piercing rounds, you're going to run out of ammunition chewing through the ablative part of this bot before you're ever able to deal with his core systems. And so, while, once again, this was one of those, this worked on paper and didn't work quite as well in practice. It also, I think, made a bad horror enemy, for a horror genre enemy, for one very specific reason that is going to be one of the next topics here, is that Meat Grinder is very melee weapon heavy. You always pretty much have a melee weapon, and you can't do to this bot the primary thing that you would want to be able to do in that sort of context, which is hold him at bay. If you press a melee weapon against this bot, it's just going to keep coming towards you. And the reason for that has to do with the way that game agents typically work, namely that they're what's called nav mesh agents. It's what this cylinder is, and they move in an utterly non-physical way across a sort of a decimation of the level called the nav mesh, which we can see here, and they're effectively welded to it. A bot moving using the nav mesh is not moving physically at all, isn't moving under force and velocity in a way that sort of interacts bidirectionally in the physics system. It's just sort of kinematically moving, period. And any sort of physics active object, like something in your hand, would just be pushed back by it. And so that's why I think these didn't quite work in Meat Grinder as well, as you should frankly be able to shove them. And so along that lines, I built the Slicer, which doesn't use a nav mesh at all, doesn't use a nav mesh agent, and is actually flying under physical force. His thrusters are actually fighting against gravity. There's a fly-by-wire system. He's actually very complex, which is a bit of a problem because I can only have, say, 4 or 5 of these active at once in a scene before it completely bogs the scene down performance-wise. Some of that is just the physics and object complexity. He could probably be optimized, and I'm probably going to try to rebuild Slicer at some point, or a robot concept like him that's way more efficient, so you could have like 20 or 30 of them active at once. But the thing that works great about Slicer, that the reason that I still love him as a bot, is that by being fully physics active, you can actually engage in melee with him, you can shove him, you can check him with a firearm. It's kinesthetically really enjoyable, which gets right at the root of like what makes H3VR so enjoyable. The problem is because he's not a nav mesh agent, right? He can't path very intelligently. He doesn't have any higher level logic for navigating a space. It's far more, you're in line of sight of him, he's going to charge you. If you're not in line of sight of him, he's going to bounce off of everything trying to get towards you, and oftentimes get stuck. But yeah, and before talking about the sort of the worst world bot here, all of these bots suffer from a similar problem that has more to do with the dramatic experience that is fighting against an agent in a game, which is frankly put something that I see complaints of in many other sorts of games. Which is that when it is you shoot a bot or you hit an agent, and the reaction is unsatisfying. Otherwise, either it isn't conveyed to you whether you've actually damaged it or not. Force impact that should be present with a given weapon doesn't seem to be being transmitted. The agent isn't staggered or doesn't seem to feel pain when it should feel pain based on what kind of agent it is, etc. And that's the big problem with pretty much all of these agents, is that there's no reactivity to them being hit. And part of that has to do with just, well, tanks don't react that way, and that I've made largely unarticulated agents. And part of the reason for that has to do with the fact that when you have physics active joint chains, i.e. things that are pseudo ragdollish in their structure, that can get very expensive performance-wise, especially when those are involved in other complex physics collisions. And so with the worst world bot, I tried to finally address some of the sort of core problems that had existed with past agents, and try to find a happy medium point. Perhaps a little oversimplified, but I wanted to start building up from a different core. And so the worst world agent is still a nav mesh based agent. We can't necessarily shove or displace his base, but obviously he's a jointed structure that can actually be rotated, hit around, etc. So multiple points of articulation, he's wibbly, he's fun to shoot because of that, even if he isn't dead yet. You hit him with something and it's immediately evident that you have struck the bot versus just missed him or hit something around. And in addition to that, he has a really sort of, I would say, overdone destruction behavior, which is just that part of the bot just shatters and explodes, and oftentimes sends flying the other parts of the bots. And that's great, and I got a lot of response from folks that was made them way more satisfying to engage. And more importantly, I found that as long as I kept the collision complexity of the bot really, really low, sort of like 1 to 2 colliders per piece, I could have this multi-joint chain and have a whole bunch of these still active in a scene at once, and not run into performance issues. So in a big way, the worst world bot was a dry run for a more complete, nuanced, and modular, sort of like tall hot dog shaped bot that I want to make. And so, on to what is being worked on right now. I know I said I was going to take a vacation this past week, but I've been doing a little bit of coding as well, because I had some breakthroughs conceptually on how I want to handle things. But what I aim to do with this next set of bots is to take the best of all worlds of the set of 5 that we see here. I want to take the internal systemic complexity of something like Clunk Mark II, in that it's a bot that will have individual subsystems located in one of the three body sections. So in the top section, we'll have a CPU and we'll have sensors. In the middle section, we'll have a power cell and fire control. And in the lower section, we'll have our navigation subsystem and our thruster control. But importantly, it will, instead of being a core nav mesh agent, it's going to be a hybrid. I've finally gotten, and that was the sort of like the revelation I had systemically, is that it's going to be a hybrid and that it's going to sort of have an invisible nav mesh agent for long range pathfinding, but is going to be full physics driven in the way that Slicer is, but more stable. So it'll be a bot that you can knock around, you can check, you can shove. If you come around a corner and the bot's suddenly there with a rifle in your face, you'll be able to actually sweep it up and press the bot against a wall, possibly teleport away, or withdraw a sidearm and shoot it. That's the goal, at least. And then on top of that, once again, have more over-the-top hit and destruction behaviors, akin to the Worst World bots, but not have them be all in one. So essentially, this new bot will be meat over metal in the way that the bot Worst here was. And so basically, it will have that ablative outer layer that will take damage from small arms and eventually be blown off. And then it will have its sort of internal pieces that will be metal, and importantly, will not necessarily require you always use armor-piercing ammunition to utilize. I've basically created a new damage model for them where concussive damage actually damages and quote-unquote stuns internal systems. Each of the internal systems I mentioned before, like the navigation computer, the sensors, etc., will be able to be momentarily disrupted by a high-impact sort of concussive impact. So say if you're using hollow points in an SMG, come around a corner, there's a bot there, and you can actually hold fire on the bot in its upper section, you're going to be disrupting, for as long as you're hitting the bot's ability to resolve where you are as a sensor contact. It may still immediately try to fire back at you, but it's not going to likely be accurate. And the whole purpose of trying to do this is to create. One of the things you'll notice with all the shooting bots in here is that all of them, their projectiles fly at about the speed of a tennis ball, maybe even slower. And part of that has to do with the fact that their behavior hasn't been nuanced and interesting enough to be able to ramp up the difficulty of fighting by making their bullets fly as fast as yours, while still being doable to fight in a way that doesn't require you cheesing them. And so that's the ultimate goal with this next generation of bot, is to create something that I can arm effectively equally to you, and that will provide an interesting and a nuanced and appropriately challenging type of combat experience for them. So yeah, and that's and I realized I got off, I tangented there. By the fact that it's a hybrid method with the nav agent, it will be physics active, but it will be able to path as intelligently as the pure nav mesh agents here. And so one of the things that I added that worked really well with the Worst World bots is that they utilize a fairly complex nav grid that's more than just the nav mesh here, but is a set of nodes that I've manually placed through a level that basically tells the bot where it can take cover. And the next generation of them, the Worst World bots are still pretty suicidal. The next generation of bots will be far more evasive and far more likely to take cover when they're, say, reloading their weapon or something like that. So you'll actually be hopefully able to engage in a far more back and forth engagement with them. So yeah, that is the plan. That is what I am working on in a determined fashion. This is as much as most of my time ends up going towards creating sort of firearm systems in terms of simulation complexity in H3. I don't think it's my secondary interest has always been in trying to create a more compelling agent, an agent that doesn't just feel like it's a target that moves. And importantly, also isn't like the sort of, how to frame this. I think there are roles for an agent to play in games that a human player that one might say fight against in a multiplayer game is never really going to be able to exhibit either, because when we fight in games, we don't have the type of sense of self-preservation that someone in an actual sort of battle conflict would have. And it's never going to be quite the same. Most game agents, as they're coded in games, are coded incredibly suicidally for dramatic effect and to make you feel powerful, and because it's much easier to do that when you have got a simple AI representation. And I want to create something far more evasive and interesting. And I don't know if I'll land there, honest to goodness. It's, as you can see, I'm 5 generations into this. All of these still have a whole bunch of problems. They're fun in some ways, they're not fun in other ways. But I'm convinced I can land on, at the very least, something else novel and interesting. And I need to, because they will be the bots in the upcoming World War II firearm update, and so they'll be armed a good deal more heavily than the Worst World bots will be. So I think that probably does it for my little devlog ramble here. I hope you all are having a wonderful week. I'm still deciding exactly on how I'm going to handle basically the period of time between now and the World War II update. I would love to get some feedback from you folks on this, namely on one of the first things that I'm getting operational for this upcoming update is the new type of bot. And now that new type of bot isn't necessarily going to fight how it's eventually going to fight in the World War II update, because I don't have a great scene for it. The arena scene here, let's be frank, this is not the best topology to actually test certain things like bots. It's got way too open sight lines from so many directions. But what I wanted to basically know from you folks is whether you would like to test those bots earlier in sort of outside the context of that update, or whether you'd rather I saved them and the experience of fighting them for the update proper. I'm of two minds of it, and I can't decide. And so I would love to hear some community response from you folks on whether you'd like to fight them ahead of time. Because if so, I would probably end up really having that in an update towards the end of August or early September, just popping them in here in a bunch of configurations for you to test out. All right, I think that's about it. I think I covered everything I wanted to cover. I hope this was at least moderately educational for you folks in terms of just how many moving pieces there are with these things and why it is so difficult to get them right. Doing bots in VR is so hard because of the performance ceiling and just all of the ways in which what you can do with your hands and the sort of the implicit physicality that you have as a player in a VR space makes making a compelling agent so difficult. You know, truth be told, I don't think I've yet fought virtual agents in any VR game that I found holistically really satisfying. Some I've enjoyed, and they're the sort of like the quality of them is being hordes and things like that, or others I've enjoyed because they've got an explosive behavior when they're destroyed. Some for their physicality. I do love the ridiculousness of Gorn's agents. But at the same time, it still feels like that doesn't fit. Those feel like agents that are still tuned for my enjoyment versus tuned for a competition with that agent. And so I'm still looking for that and still trying to make it in my own way in this. So it's yet another example of how so much of the orthodoxy of game design that we do has to be thrown out the window, or at least heavily reconsidered when making VR games. So yeah, enough ramble. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I'll talk to you soon. Peace.